I've been working with cameras professionally for over 15 years now, but I always think it's interesting to look back and see, okay, if right now I was just starting off and I had to buy a camera and budget was my primary concern, because if I'm not working professionally yet, I don't have money to spend. So if I had to factor in budget, what is the perfect camera I would buy now in 2024 that would check all the boxes and get the job done to a sufficient degree where I don't have to break the bank? And long story short, I'll just cut right to the chase. And spoilers, it's the GH5. But there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to go into them. And this was actually inspired by a recent video that Rhett Thompson put out on the kind of best budget cameras from a Lumix perspective. He interviews all sorts of creators in this video, and they each give their take on why they have a particular Lumix camera that's their favorite. But since I'm not in this video, I thought I would take the time to make my own video and tell you why, for me, it is the GH5. We're going to go through the specs and talk about why this camera is still relevant in 2024. If you look at the price, that's the first thing, right? We're talking about budget. Now, if you have no money, $0, then yeah, film with your phone, film with a GoPro, film with whatever camera you can find at the local Goodwill. It doesn't really matter if you absolutely have no money. But if we're trying to find that balance between, okay, what are we spending versus what are we getting? I would highly, highly recommend the GH5 even to this day. Yes, there's newer cameras like the GH6, the G9 Mark II. You've got the full frame cameras from Canon and Sony and Nikon, but I still think there's a place for something like the Lumix GH5. If you look at this price, roughly $600. This is used on B&H. You can find them on eBay. You can find them on Amazon. You might even find them on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, wherever you're looking. I'd say anywhere between $500 to $600 is the current market value for a used GH5. And if I put that in perspective, my first hybrid mirrorless camera was the GH1 that I bought for $600 in 2010, maybe, I think is when I bought that camera. So $600 back then compared to $600 now for a GH5 that has all these specs that we're going to get into. And just to put that in comparison, when I bought the GH1, I was in college. I didn't have a lot of money, but I wanted a shallow depth of field camera that could shoot true 1080p HD. We're past that now. We're going 4K. But back then, $600 was my price point for value to cost. And it's funny that it still works out to being roughly a similar price point even nowadays with the GH5. So what does the GH5 do that's so special? Well, the GH4 was the first, real affordable option when it came to 4K video. Well, the GH5 expanded upon that with giving you 4K plus a lot of other things. I think if I was going to buy any camera nowadays, it would have to be 4K minimum. I don't think I could justify spending money on a camera nowadays in 2024 that wasn't 4K. So it's got 4K, but it also has 4K 60. So you can shoot slow motion 4K. If you're shooting 4K on the GH5, you can do that in 422 10-bit. So color is going to be a lot better on the GH5 than if you're coming from something like the GH4, where we didn't quite have all the codecs optimized. The GH4 also had a recording limit. Well, not a recording limit, but it would chunk up the video file into clips, like 4-minute clips, which is kind of irritating to deal with. The GH5 solved all of that. The GH5 added in-body image stabilization. And if you're talking about filmmaking, photography, whatever it is on a budget, I think you want to be able to do it all with a camera, and you don't want to have to worry about buying gimbals or steady cams or shoulder rigs or anything like that. Stabilization is critical, and having it built right into the camera. And the IBIS on the GH5 is really good, actually. It's one of the best. For the longest time, Lumix was just, and they still are in a lot of ways, dominating the stabilization space, especially on these Micro Four Third cameras, because the sensor smaller makes it a little bit easier. There is a lot to love about the GH5. If you want to look at expanding your options with XLR inputs, the GH5 actually works with an adapter that lets you take XLR. So there's some expansion opportunities with the GH5 that you don't get with things like the GH4. And then if you're looking at things like the GH6, yes, the GH6 is arguably better, but it's also costs more. And again, we're trying to maximize specs to budget. And the GH5 does enough of those things. There are certain limitations in certain modes, like the 4K 60 is 8-bit 420. It's not 422 10-bit, but honestly, that's fine. the GH5 doesn't, unless you can find it, it doesn't come with a vlog or flat picture profile. I mean, technically there are flat profiles like Cinelike D and Cinelike V, but it doesn't have a log profile natively. You could look at getting something like the GH5 Mark II, but I would argue the GH5 Mark I is still the better price point, performance, all those things. The best bang for your buck is going to be the GH5, because at the end of the day, if you're just getting started off and you're getting into budget filmmaking, photography, whatever it is, you don't need log. And you probably, even if you're a professional, a lot of times you don't need log. You can shoot with the standard profiles, the natural profiles, the flatter profiles. And if you want to explore color grading, you certainly can. But I would say from a beginner standpoint, a lot of times color grading is the hardest part of the equation. So the more you can get it right in camera, the better off you're going to be. And you can shoot in a faster, more efficient, more streamlined way when you're not worried about log and spending all this time color grading and post production. You can just focus on getting beautiful images right in the camera, and the GH5 will do that. Let's scroll down this list and really dive into these specs, because yes, it's micro four thirds, so it's not full frame. If that's something that really matters to you, expect you're going to spend a little bit more. I might look at something like the A7S Mark II, which used nowadays are a little bit more affordable, but they have less megapixels, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it doesn't matter if you're not worried about photography as much, but I'm going at this from a hybrid content creator perspective. You want to shoot video, you want to take photos all in one camera body, because oftentimes nowadays we need to make things like thumbnails. So you want to be able to take a photo, or you want to, your friend, you think you're going to be a video professional, and then your friend sees you with a camera and says, "Hey, I want to pay you to take some photos." It'd be really nice to have that ability. So I think hybrid is the way to go. Of course, there's that sensor shift 5-axis image stabilization we already talked about. We've got ISO sensitivities, of course, continuous shooting, internal modes. These are all the codecs and the ways that you can produce the content, and it kind of does everything you would need. Of course, it's got HDMI output, which is helpful, not essential. You don't need to worry about external monitoring, but it's there if you need it. And it's got the dual card slots. So nice benefit is that when you're shooting with two cards, you can either shoot redundant. So in case a card corrupts or something, some problem happens with the footage on one card, you've got the other one there as a backup, or you can actually split your photo and video between the two cards. And it can just be nice to have two slots for cards. Maybe you're filming a really long event, you're taking a lot of photos, two cards right in the camera, and it doubles your capacity for recording. We've got good audio inputs and outputs. A lot of cameras, even from this generation, were still struggling and catching up to having proper mic inputs, having proper headphone outputs, monitoring correctly. I mean, Sony, Canon, Nikon, they were kind of all catching up, and they're figuring it out. But the GH4 and the GH5 were from that era where they were kind of ahead in a lot of the ways, where it just had all those features that you wanted as a true hybrid content creator, and it just did it all. We've got the articulating screen, which right now, this is a GH5 Mark II that you're looking at. And that screen flipped around so I can see myself. Very, very helpful. GH5 doesn't have perfect continuous autofocus, but the autofocus is good. This is kind of a misnomer. It's a shorthand that a lot of people say about the Lumix cameras, is that the autofocus is bad, the autofocus is bad, the autofocus is bad. It's notorious for bad autofocus, but what everyone means when they say that is it's bad at continuous tracking autofocus. So if you put the camera into autofocus and you just want it to continuous autofocus in video, yeah, it's not good for that. You're going to get some pulsing. It's going to be a little weird. But the camera can autofocus, single autofocus, and it can do it quite well. And a lot of times, if you're filming yourself, you're usually within a distance where you can actually focus on yourself and it's not a problem. And if you're working professionally using it for money, a lot of times you're going to be able to manual focus on your subject, your content, whatever it is. Or you can also engage the autofocus to get it in focus, and then you disengage the autofocus. There's a nice way to do this using the back button on this camera. So when people say Lumix doesn't have good autofocus, it's not like it's missing the autofocus. It just can't hold it. It can't track it as well as Sony can with some of the eye tracking that they've really perfected over the last few years. And of course, it's not full frame. But again, we're talking about on a budget. Does it check all the boxes? Does it give you all the features you need? And I would still argue that the GH5 is all of those at the cheapest price. Let's see, what else do we have? There's no built-in ND filters, of course, but none of the cameras really of this style have that. I do think that's unfortunate. I'm expecting we'll be going to start seeing that soon in newer cameras, but new cameras are expensive. They're $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. We're talking about something that's $600 and it's a little bit older, and that's totally fine. You've got cool modes like time lapse. I think Lumix is another thing, the kind of unsung hero of the Lumix system is that they perfected time lapse really early on. So you can shoot photo or video time lapse right in the camera. If that's something that's valuable to you, maybe you want to make some stock footage or you just need that functionality, it's really easy to do it all in camera. You don't need an intervalometer, you don't need extra batteries or anything else. It just can do a time lapse. And again, a lot of the other camera companies have caught up, but if you go back and you're looking for something used that's a little bit cheaper, some of these older cameras, they're not going to have the flip screen that you want. They're not going to have some of the nicer features like the time lapse, like the stabilization, like the 42210 bit. These were really cutting edge features at the time. And I think even to this day, they still hold up quite well. What else do we have on the list? So here's all your specs you can record in. We've got there's no streaming. The GH5 Mark II, they added the streaming functionality. For me, that's not an essential. I wouldn't be focused on streaming capabilities. I don't find it all that reliable anyway, but it is there if you need it. The GH5 you can connect. I should say it's got Wi-Fi, it's got Bluetooth, so you can connect it to a smartphone app, so you can control all the settings remote. That's another way you can kind of tap into the autofocus capabilities. Again, not continuous autofocus, but being able to enable and disable or engage and disengage autofocus you can do with the Lumix Sync app. You pair the camera to the iPhone, and it's got really great, actually, live streaming, I guess, streaming, monitoring. Live monitoring is a better way. It's not streaming, it's any platform. But if you need to send signal from the camera across a room to a client, you can set up an iPad or an iPhone to where they can monitor wirelessly and you're not running cables and you have actually control over the camera settings through that Lumix Sync app. So it's kind of a cool wireless feature that, again, at this time from this generation of cameras was kind of a unique thing and still works to this day and works quite well, actually. We've got some more features here. You've got the viewfinder built in. So that's something, some cameras, they don't have the viewfinder. They only have the LCD. And I would argue it's not essential, but it's nice to have both, especially if you're trying to do any kind of outdoor photography or even outdoor video. And just being able to put your eye to that viewfinder is very helpful. It can be another point of stabilization if you press the camera against your eye, or just being able to shield kind of the bright light, especially if you're outside and it's the sun. You can look through the viewfinder and you don't have as many exposure issues. We've got a great selection of native lenses. Actually, this is the other reason I would maybe pick something like the GH5, because the native lens selection for Micro Four Thirds, there's so many lenses. They've been around for so long. You can pick them up used at all different price points. So let's not forget, half of a camera is the lens that you're putting on it, especially in this category. E-mount lenses, especially full frame ones, are still highly sought after. They can be more expensive. They're bigger. They're heavier. These Lumix Micro Four Third lenses, a lot of them people don't really want anymore. You can scoop them up pretty cheap, especially things like the 12 to 35, which is a great lens, or arguably even better is the Leica 10 to 25. And that's not a budget lens by any means, but if I had to buy one lens for Micro Four Thirds, it would be the Panasonic Leica Lumix, Lumix Leica, whatever they call it. The Panasonic Leica 10 to 25. It's arguably one of the greatest lenses ever made for Micro Four Thirds, and it should do basically everything you would ever need. Yes, it doesn't have insane reach, but I find that those situations are fewer and far between for the type of stuff I like to do. If you're into birding and wildlife or I don't know, sports, you're going to want a longer lens, but for YouTubing, content creation, video production, photography, a 10 to 25 on Micro Four Thirds is going to check a lot of those boxes for you. Let's scroll down here and see if there's any final thoughts on the camera. But I bought the GH5, I think pretty much right when it came out, because it's just such a powerful, game-changing camera. Got to throw that buzzword in there. Game changer. GH5 really was, and it still is. It still holds up. It's got things. Okay, so here's where we get into the things that I care most about, actually, that aren't even on the spec sheet. See, if you scroll down through the specs, they're not going to highlight this stuff, but it's the stuff that I personally find really valuable. And actually, it is on here if you look. The GH5, you can shoot in the anamorphic mode, but don't even worry about anamorphic lenses. It's an option if you want it. It's great, but it's 4x3. It's open gate. If you understand open gate production, you know the value of it. If you don't, I highly recommend you look it up and figure it out. You can shoot open gate on the GH5, no problem. GH5 also has things like shutter angle. You might be tempted to want shutter speed, and that's fine. You can shoot that way if you want. For photography, it's shutter speed, but for video and filmmaking, you should be using shutter angle. There's a lot of reasons why. I'm not going to get into them right now, but the GH5 has shutter angle. Even most modern cameras, the expensive ones, the $3,000, the $4,000, the $5,000 cameras from Sony, Canon, Nikon, they don't give you what I consider essential filmmaking tools like shutter angle. The GH5 had it, it still has it, and you can have it for $600. I think even the GH4 had it, but with the GH4, you're not getting 4K 60. You're losing out on things like the color, which we already talked about. So arguably, you're not getting the IBIS. That's huge. No in-body image stabilization on the GH4. You can probably find them cheaper. But again, in that price to performance, the value ratio, again, if your budget is $0, go with whatever makes sense. If your budget is $300, go with what makes sense. If the goal is what's the best camera for my budget, meaning my budget is kind of flexible and I just want to spend as little as possible, but I'm maybe willing to stretch and invest a little bit, the GH5 still has its place. You could also look at things like the GH6, which arguably, yes, are better, even with more codecs, more flavors, more options. The screen, I think, is better on the GH6, but these are small refinements from the GH5. So I think Lumix kind of looked at the GH5. They made an incredible camera at the time, way outcompeted everything else at the time. And that's why it still holds up to this day. But then the GH6 was just a refinement on that. So if you do want to spend a little bit more, I think a GH6 you could probably scoop up for $1,000 used now. They're not that old yet. GH5, it's pretty old, getting pretty up there. So if you're going to pick up one used, make sure it comes from a reputable source. Make sure you check it out, make sure it works, and there's no major issues with it. But you can find a GH5 for $600. I think that's an incredible value for a camera that I still use. So it's not just sometimes you buy the cheap thing because it's cheap, but then it doesn't last. The beauty about the GH5 is that even though it's cheap, relatively cheap, it will still last. 4K is not going away. 422 10-bit is not going away. You don't often need things like RAW. I think there are actually ways that you can film RAW on the GH5 if you'd like, using some external monitor recording devices. But again, I'm not getting into that because that's more stuff you're buying and that inflates the cost unnecessarily. You probably don't need RAW. You don't necessarily need log profiles. You can do so much with so little in something like a GH5. And I mean, look at it. It's smooth. It's like the perfect size. It's the perfect weight. It's smooth, it's rounded, it's comfortable to hold. The buttons, the interface, everything about it just kind of works great. Got that flip out screen that everyone loves. The GH6 screen is better, I would argue, but the GH5 screen is also great. And it just does so much. So here on this back button dial, see where you got your autofocus, continuous autofocus, single manual focus. So you can switch between them. But a trick that I like to do is put the camera in manual focus mode, but then that button there, that AF lock button, you can program that to engage autofocus. So you can just hold that button, autofocus turns on, it gets your subject in focus. You let go of the button, you're back in manual focus. And that's a great way to shoot because you got manual focus, you got the great control. Now, one helpful thing of the GH6 is that you can punch in to get critical focus during recording. You can't do that on the GH5, unfortunately. You can get critical focus before you're recording, but while you're filming, you can't do critical focus, and that is unfortunate. But you can use that autofocus to your advantage. Again, think single autofocus. I can focus one time. It's going to get it right. It's not going to track because it's going to pulse. It can't do continuous all that well for video, but for photo, you'd be fine. I mean, it's going to miss focus every once in a while, but in general, it's going to do pretty good. We're talking about video continuous autofocus. You can engage single autofocus, let the camera will get it right for you. So even if you can't see it quite right, the screen's a little small, you don't have a monitor, you can't do critical focus, you can engage autofocus anytime you want, get it in focus, and then let that button go, and you'll be pretty good. I think the critical focus punch in on the GH5 is like 20x. It's something absurd. You can get like zoomed in on a pixel basically on this thing. And it's just a great camera. It's really held up. I think the GH4 was big at the time because it offered 4K in an affordable package and price point in this mirrorless hybrid market. But the GH5 just blew it out of the water. And then we got the GH6, which was a refinement. So I'm curious to see if there is a GH7 on the horizon, what that will entail. But if I had to go back and do it all over again, it's a GH5, it would still be my choice. It was my choice at the time. It's still my choice to this day as far as affordable budget filmmaking, photography, whatever it might be to get your feet wet, to get started, to get going, to start creating content. You've got incredible pairings that people are well aware of, things like the Metabone Speed Booster. You can expand your field of view to get more of that APS-C, that Super 35 look, which is filmmaking 101, just get that like that little bit bigger sensor, that shallower depth of field, that appearance, the wider field of view. You can do that with things like the Speed Booster. You can use great lenses like the Sigma 18 to 35. It's an incredibly fast lens. It's an incredibly sharp lens. There's plenty of them. They're probably pretty cheap now. Honestly, I haven't looked recently. We could take a look. The Sigma 18 to 35. I'm sure they still sell them new. $500 for the Nikon mount. We are going to get the Canon mount. Why don't they have it for Canon on B&H? Maybe this is, am I looking in the new section? Oh, here we go. So 18 to 35 Canon EF. We've got $600. They even have cinema versions. If that's your preference, you can get that. But for me, I would go with something like the EF, Canon EF, or Nikon. Honestly, it would be fine. And maybe pick up one of these used for like $500 with a speed booster. Like even those are really cheap. Viltrox makes them, Metabones makes them. Plenty of speed boosters that will communicate with the lens, with the camera, and it's just a match made in heaven. There's a reason that there's still plenty of professionals working using the GH5 with combinations like the Sigma 18 to 35, and they're making money. So if you want to get started and make money too, yes, you can invest in the latest and greatest. You can buy a Komodo, you can buy a Z8, you can buy an R5 or a A7S3. But there's a lot of value in you just getting started, upgrading a little bit, spending a little bit of money for something that's going to do so much. I think it wouldn't take much to make your money back from a combination like the GH5 with the speed booster and the 18 to 35. I think you'd make your money back real quick, and probably one project, honestly. And that's a camera that's going to do essentially everything you could ever want and more. It's got the stabilization, it's got the codecs you want, it's got the resolution you want, open gate, shutter angle, photography, all in one device. The batteries last a while. You can buy Wasabi third-party batteries for really, really cheap. It's just a powerhouse of a camera, that GH5. And that's why I still love it.